This episode of The Climate Show is brought to you by Celsius.co.nz, HotTopic.co.nz and Kiwi FM.
What good is a drop in the ocean? What good is a drop in the ocean?
Well, hello and welcome along to The Climate Show. This is episode number 2. It's a program all about climate news, science, policy, politics, and of course, the solutions as well. None of this possible without my co-host. Of course, it is Gareth Ronalden at HotTopic.co.nz, hot-topic.co.nz. Hello to you, Gareth.
Hi Glenn, how are you going?
I'm very well. How's it going down on the farm at the moment? I hear the weather's been pretty hot.
Yeah, we had a really hot Saturday, we had a really cold Sunday, and now it's hot again. So yeah, it's climate disruption, I think.
But no doubt keeping you busy as well with all the stuff that needs doing down there.
Yeah, if you want a peaceful life, don't have a vineyard.
Hey, well, it's a great show that we've got lined up today. Let's in fact talk about our special guest. I'm really excited about her, Naomi Oreskes.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really privileged to get her on because she's written a fantastic book called Merchants of Doubt, which really looks at the roots of the campaign to deny the reality of climate change. And she goes right back to the 50s and 60s and the techniques that the tobacco industry developed. But anyway, Naomi will talk more about that later on. It's a really important case that she's making, and I'm hoping that it'll be valuable for all of our listeners and viewers and podcast land, or whatever we call it.
Yeah, and I've certainly been having a bit of fun digging through that book myself. And of course, we've got for John back from skepticalscience.com, and the story that we're talking about today pops out of something that I saw on Mashable.com that I thought I'd forward to John, and it turns out he actually has a link to the story, something called a Twitter bot that debates climate change automatically on Twitter.
Yeah, it's a great story, that. It seems to have amused both sides of the argument too.
Yeah.
So it'd be good to talk to John about that.
Yeah. And of course, very shortly, some news as well, just some general news that's been doing the rounds at the moment. Bit of feedback, of course, coming through from a couple of shows as well, which is great, on Hot Topic.
Yeah, there's some really nice comments. There's been some requests for things that we might cover, so they're all being fed into the machine, and Glenn and I will sort of chew them out as sausages of podcasts at some point.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's becoming really obvious to me, Gareth, is just the amount of content and the amount of possible people that we can have on this show. I'm sort of feeling slightly overwhelmed by it all, actually.
Yeah, well, there is. I think it's a sign of the thing that you spotted early on, Glenn, and that is that there is really not a lot of coverage in this field. Very few media outlets that go into the subject in any real depth.
Yeah.
And there's just such a huge quantity of material and really interesting people working in climate-related areas that it's just a great seam to mine, frankly.
Exactly, and
it's a non-fossil fuel seam to mine.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, and also plenty of news as well. I think we should dig into the first story now. You've got this image that you put up on hot-topic.co.nz that makes absolutely no sense to me. Explain what it looks like and what it's all about.
Okay, well, I actually found this image on the website of the CE Journal, which is it's an environmental journalism website, and one of their authors, Tom Yulsman, put this up as a quiz, and I looked at it and I thought, now what's all that red? Now that red's usually warm, isn't it? And what he'd done was to take the data for the monthly anomalies in global surface temperature from the NASA Goddard Institute series, the GISS series, for the last 100 years. So if you look on the left-hand side of the image, you see lots of blues and yellows and white dots. That's 100 years ago. So each vertical column is a year, and there's the 12 months of the year going down the column. And so as you come through, you might sort of see a vaguely a few yellows and oranges. Well, those are the 1930s, and then it gets a bit more blues. So, around about sort of 30 years ago, you start to get reds creeping in, and then you get reds, and then you get really dark, sort of black-brown colours and so on. So the very last line on the right-hand side is 2010, and the two little grey blocks on the bottom, those are the November and December temperatures, because we don't know what they are.
Okay.
And I just thought it was a fantastic graphic, because we're all familiar with the sort of rising line of how the world temperature rise goes up. This was another way of putting it that was just, I thought, a really fantastic way of showing how different what we're experiencing now is from what it was 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So really good information graphic, I thought.
Yeah, and I think that's what people find quite helpful, is that they can see that information graphically, displayed in front of them just like that, and understand it. And for me, that's really concerning, going from all those nice blues and turquoise colours through to some yellows and oranges, and then this fierce red at the end of the picture.
Absolutely. It really sort of marks out how unusual what we're seeing now is in the context of the last 100 years.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I thought it was a really good story. In fact, I'm very tempted to use it for a new background for the Hot Topic logo.
Cool. On to the next story, Gareth, about the Climate Vulnerable Forum held in Kiribati last week.
Yes, that's right. It was 19 countries got together and arrived at what they called the AMBO Declaration, which is basically, it's the small and vulnerable nations saying, come on to the rest of the world, get some action going. And after the failure of the Copenhagen climate talks, with the Cancun, Mexico talks starting in a week or 10 days' time, they wanted to kind of up the pressure. So the AMBO Declaration was adopted by 12 countries. That was Australia, Brazil, China, Cuba, Fiji, Japan, Kiribati, the Maldives, Marshall Islands, New Zealand, Solomon Islands, and Tonga. And the US, UK, and Canada agreed that they would be observers, and they were a bit too much of a wuss to sign up, those three countries. But I thought it was an interesting story which we've covered at Hot Topic, and what really surprised me was, well, actually Brian Walker covered it at Hot Topic, my co-blogger, and what really surprised me was the extent to which we got a kind of pushback from New Zealand's little skeptical community. Ian Wishart had a go at it. Richard Treadgold, one of the guys behind the legal case that skeptics are taking against NIWA, the custodians of the New Zealand climate data, he had a go at it as well. And it struck me that the Pacific issue is clearly something that New Zealand skeptics take very seriously, and they can't really let it go unchallenged. They want to suggest that sea level isn't rising, that it's not causing a problem for the islands. And there's this terrible kind of xenophobia going on that, no, we don't want to send them any money, we don't want to help them. It's just poor people trying to screw the rich countries, for undeserved monies. And yet the fact is that the sea level is rising, and the islands are going to change out of all recognition. That perhaps the really low-lying ones won't entirely disappear, because corals can match quite fast rates of sea level rise. They managed to do it at the end of the last ice age, for instance, when sea levels rose 160 meters. So we know that they can keep up with fast sea level rise, but that's not the same thing as maintaining a nice, lush tropical paradise. And living on a pile of coral rubble is not a very attractive prospect, particularly if there's no fresh water for anyone to drink.
So the skeptics won't be entirely happy or convinced about the argument of the sea level rise on the islands until the islands are completely covered in water, as opposed to slightly degraded or the lifestyle of the people there affected.
I think that's for some of them that's undoubtedly true. I just think that it's an issue. It's a hot button issue for our local skeptics, because it's very close to home. Auckland is the world's biggest Polynesian city, And if somehow the skeptics admit that there's a problem in their neighbourhood, then it's going to, it's a concession they don't seem willing to make. Whereas I think that for New Zealand, we actually have a real duty to help, not just because so many of the islanders are citizens of New Zealand, but because it's our region, we have a role to play, we have a responsibility. And to be honest, I think that New Zealand's ability to help, we're not a heavily populated country, and if we can help these islands and their communities have a long-term future, then frankly, I think we should.
And there's a great website as well, climate.gov.ki, where there's the Climate Change in Kiribati website as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And they've got video from the conference. There's lots of data and images to use. Yeah, it's a good place to go.
Yeah. Right, on to the next story about the steady loss of sea ice in the eastern Arctic. It could produce significant changes in the region's atmospheric circulation, possibly resulting in a period of colder winters, Gareth.
What's going on there? Well, some new research coming out of the Potsdam Institute in Germany suggests that what's happening is that as the sea ice melts in summer, that means that a lot of it has to freeze back up in the autumn. And as the ice freezes up again, it releases a lot of heat to the atmosphere. And this sort of pulse of heat coming out in autumn and early winter has the effect of displacing the normal flow of weather patterns around the northern hemisphere, and that tends to create cooler than normal winters in some places by affecting the wind flows. I mean, in somewhere like Britain or France, Western Europe, if the wind's coming from the west in winter, it's generally warm and mild and rainy. If it comes from the east, it's coming straight from Russia and tends to be cold and snowy. So a change in the weather patterns that brings a lot of seas to Western Europe means they get cold winters. So it's a really interesting thing. It's counterintuitive. And it's another one of those things that plays to the skeptics, because they like nothing more than saying, hey, look, there's lots of snow in Washington or London, that global warming, what's happened to that then? The fact is that this was something that's emerging from the fact of warming in the Arctic. And it's one of the interesting things about climate change is that it isn't just about warming everywhere, it's about changes to the climate. And some of those changes can involve cooling in certain seasons and changes to the seasons too. So it's an interesting one. There's quite a lot of this data coming out, and I'm going to be writing about it on the blog sometime over the next month. So one to watch. And
isn't it true, Gareth, that it's also not about what you feel when you walk out the door, but it's about those extreme events, like an extreme heat wave? There'll be more of those. It's not about the every single week, every single day noticing something. It's about those extremes, sort of.
It's you can think about climate change as just being changes in the long-term averages, and yes, that is happening, and you can see it. But it is also about changes in the frequencies of extremes and how extreme those extremes are. If you see what I mean, there will be more heat waves, and the heat waves will be hotter, and we can see that from the Australian data over the last decade. So, yeah, it's extremes are made worse by the change in climate. The warming that's going on is making these things happen. But the sort of European winter angle is interesting because it's a change in the pattern of weather that's bringing the change. So it's one I'm going to be watching closely over the coming winter, and as I said, I'm going to do a sort of rather more detailed look at some of the papers that have been published in this area.
Great. Look forward to that. Well, our final news item for the day. I noticed this popping up in New Scientist magazine this week. An independent analysis has been done of Europe's biofuel plans to reduce greenhouse emissions by 2020, and it's reported that the plans may in fact produce not less but more emissions. In order to grow crops for biofuel along with Europe's food, millions of hectares would need to be cleared in order to do that, releasing more than twice as much carbon as Europe's cars would produce if they stuck with petrol.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing that, if you do something stupid, then yes, that's not a good idea. So we've got to be smart about the way that we use biofuels. And the best example of the sort of counterproductiveness of a misplaced biofuel policy is probably the USA's ethanol production, which they do from corn, sweet corn, basically, and they turn that into ethanol, and that has whether that has any carbon benefit at all remains to be seen. But what it has done is forced the price of maize up. And a couple of years ago, in Mexico, they could hardly afford their tortillas. So you've got to be clever about the way you go about it. And if you recall, a couple of shows ago, we spoke to Kevin Cudby about going to biofuels in New Zealand, and he made the very strong point that you shouldn't be trying to grow your biofuels on prime farmland. You should be using the marginal stuff, the stuff that isn't being used for productive agriculture at the moment. Now, it may be that there's not so much of that around in Europe. I actually don't think that's the case. In Britain, for instance, until recently anyway, they were paying farmers to not farm land because they didn't want surpluses, so their land was being set aside. So some of that could be used perhaps, but it's biofuels. You've got to be clever with biofuels.
Yeah,
they're not a panacea, but they're a part of the solution.
Yeah, indeed. We should get Naomi Oreskes on very shortly. She's the author of Merchants of Doubt. Very much looking forward to chatting with her. But before we get her on, I do want to thank our media partner for the climate show, Celsius.co.nz, Celsius with an S in the middle, CELSIAS.co.nz. Great wee website to pop along to and catch up on all the news around sustainable business practices, and I know they're expanding beyond that as well. But very much appreciate them having and carrying the climate show on their blog there as well. All right, so Gareth, what do you reckon? This is a good time to bring on our guest.
Absolutely.
All right, well, we've got Naomi Oreskes, who is an American science historian and professor of history and science studies at the University of California in San Diego. She is the author of Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. It's a book that exposes the influence of these scientists on political and public opinion, and how they misrepresented science and, in fact, turned science in on itself to further the cause of the free market. Naomi joins us in Brisbane, care of the University of Queensland, where she is currently on tour. Hello to you, Naomi. Thanks very much for joining us.
Hello. Thanks for having me on the show.
And how is the hospitality in Australia there for you?
It's fantastic, as you'd expect.
It sounds as though from your schedule that you're seeing all of Australia in about 5 days, which is a big ask.
Just about. They haven't sent me to Darwin, but other than that, I think I'm going in Canberra, but everywhere else.
Okay, I'd just like to say that Merchants of Doubt, your book, is a fantastic read. I read it over the weekend because I wanted to be fully prepared to talk to you. And I just thought it was something that possibly every politician in America should be forced to read. But what I wanted to start off by asking you, Naomi, was how did you start out on this project? What got you interested in this area?
Well, it's sort of a complicated story, and it has a few parts, but I'm a historian of earth science, and I was working on a book on the history of oceanography, and in doing that work, I came across the work of people like Roger Revelle and Dave Keeling, who were concerned about the possibility of climate change caused by greenhouse gases way back in the 1950s. And of course, we all know about the Keeling curve, but few people ever stopped to ask the question, well, why did Dave Keeling start measuring CO2 in 1958 anyway? And the answer is because he and Revelle and some others understood even then that increased greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels could cause climate change. So I came across this work in my research as a historian of science, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. I don't think most people understand that scientists have been interested in this issue for so long, and I don't think most people understand that scientists have actually predicted many of the changes that we're now seeing as far back as the 1950s. So I started getting interested in climate science. I started learning more about it. I started getting worried. The more I learned about it, the more I realized what a serious problem this was and how secure the science was. And I also realized that there was a big disconnect between the way the science was being presented in the American media and what scientists had to say about it. So I wrote an article that was published in Science magazine in 2004, in which I analyzed the scientific literature, and I said, well, look, if you look at the scientific literature, you see there's really no debate among climate scientists that global warming is real, it's happening, it's underway, and it's largely caused by human activities. After that paper came out, the paper got a huge amount of attention. I got a lot of phone calls from people in the media who were really stunned by this result, which was a big surprise to a lot of people, even though it really shouldn't have been. And I also started receiving hate email, and I was threatened by certain people who are actually subjects of Merchants of Doubt. So that harassment, the threatening emails, that made me realize that I had stumbled on something bigger than just a little piece of the history of science. And so I started, looking into that more deeply.
It was amazing that paper, from a standing start, you suddenly got the attention of, every denialist in the world seemed to come down on you like a ton of bricks, because you'd come up with something that it was very hard to deny. And you'd put a new piece of proof into the sort of brick wall that was being assembled. And I think it was a guy called Benny Pizer, wasn't it, who attempted to debunk your paper, but failed miserably. But it took years, I think, to get him to admit that he hadn't reproduced your paper.
Right. And I mean, this was a big part of what I came to understand, was that a big part of the denialist strategy is to insist that there's no scientific consensus and that there's really a big argument. We really don't know if the science is secure or not. And my paper showed that that was simply false. And so that became something that the denialists had to refute, because if my analysis was correct, then it showed that they were wrong about the state of the science. And so they started attacking me. And as you say, Benny Pizer, who was a sports anthropologist, knew nothing about climate science and had no credentials to challenge my work as a historian, attacked me when all on the internet. His attack got sent around by Mark Morano, who works for Senator James Inhofe in the United States. So this whole attack machine got launched. And of course, one good thing about being a historian is that everything is material. So I thought, this is, something is going on here. There's a phenomenon that I didn't know about, and that obviously a lot of people don't know about. And who is Benny Pizer? Why is he attacking me? Why is this attack being spread by a U.S. senator? I got attacked by the U.S. senator. So clearly I had stepped on a big landmine, and so I started researching the landmine.
So Naomi, does your book show that the attacks that you received were the very same and very similar attacks that scientists who are looking at tobacco and the relation to cancer and the relation between emissions and acid rain, are those attacks the same attacks? Is there a same thread that goes throughout all of those, right through to the climate change issue?
Exactly. And in the book, I don't talk about my own personal experience, because I really didn't want the book to be about me. I wanted the book to be about this larger historical issue. But when this happened, and I spoke to a couple of colleagues to try to get advice, several people said to me, you need to talk to Ben Santer, you need to talk to Justin Lancaster. And so I started talking to these other scientists and discovered that they had been attacked not only in the same way, but by the same people in some cases. And so that was part of the story that we started unraveling. And I need to acknowledge my co-author here as well. So I was at a conference in 2005, and I started talking to a fellow historian of science, Eric Conway, who had done research on the history of the science related to ozone depletion. And I was telling him about this particular attack from one particular person who we talk about in the book. And Eric said, oh, well, he was the person who attacked Sherry Rowland over the scientific evidence of ozone depletion. So Eric and I started trading notes, and then we realized, then we saw what we had, that the same people had challenged, the same people who were challenging my work and challenging the work of climate scientists had also challenged the scientific evidence of ozone depletion. They challenged the scientific evidence of acid rain, and some of them, two of the key players in the stories, had worked for the tobacco industry. And we realized that it was that tobacco connection which was key, because it was the tobacco industry who had invented this whole strategy of doubt mongering, of trying to undermine science, that pointed to the harms of tobacco.
So the basic thesis is that the tobacco industry invented the techniques of selling doubt as their product. And this was then picked up on by three former rocket scientists or senior physicists, Robert Jastrow, William Nierenberg, who was actually an oceanographer, wasn't he?
Well, he was actually a physicist. Nierenberg, like Seitz and Jastrow, all three were physicists. But like many important American scientific institutions were run and directed by physicists during the Cold War, including many oceanographic institutions, because the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, like many other scientific organizations in the United States, did a tremendous amount of work for the U.S. military at Scripps, mostly for the U.S. Navy. So even though he was a physicist, he rose to a position of power and influence in an oceanography institution because of his expertise in relation to weapons systems and anti-submarine warfare.
This doubt, though, that you talk about in science, though, it's crucial, isn't it? I mean, it's healthy to have skepticism when it comes to science.
Well, exactly, and this is the brilliance of the strategy, and it's why it's so hard to know how to respond to. So doubt is a crucial part of science. It's doubt that drives investigation, curiosity, skepticism are all crucial parts of people being curious about the natural world, people investigating things, people being willing to challenge conventional wisdom and consider that the explanations for things could be different than what we assume. But what these doubt mongers or denialists do is they take that healthy, natural part of science and they turn it against it. So it's a kind of jujitsu move, and they exaggerate the uncertainty, and they use the uncertainty to try to undermine knowledge that is actually established.
One of the things that struck me was that I'd never come across the book before, but they actually wrote a handbook of how to go about sowing doubt.
Right. This was a staggering discovery. There were many things we found that we just, we couldn't believe our eyes at some of the things we found. And this particular handbook, Bad Science, a source book, it's a resource book, a how-to handbook for how to challenge any science that you don't like. And this was circulated among various people affiliated with different regulated industries who could then use this to challenge any science that they needed to challenge. And it included a list of experts, a kind of like experts for hire, scientists who would be willing to speak up on behalf of a regulated industry or potentially regulated industry to say, I'm a scientist, I don't agree, and therefore create the impression of a scientific debate, even in areas like tobacco, where there was an overwhelming consensus of genuine experts and a huge overwhelming quantity of empirical evidence.
In one part of the book, I sense a real frustration that you perhaps couldn't say all of the things that you wanted to say, in particular about Fred Singer, because he does seem to have a modus operandi which involves going straight for the jugular.
Yeah, well, in general, I have to say, I believe that Eric Conway and I really said what we felt needed to be said in this book. But you are right. There's the famous scene in the movie The Wizard of Oz where Auntie M confronts the Wicked Witch of the West, and she says, for 30 years I've been wanting to tell you what I think of you, but as a Christian woman, I just can't. So it's a little like that.
Absolutely. Do you stamp your feet and get to return to the US?
Well, mainly we take a deep breath, drink a good glass of white wine, and just keep doing the work.
So the next question really is, with all of this laid out so nicely, why do people believe them? I mean, what is it that they have done that enables them to be taken seriously by the political elite in the US?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Of course, in the book, we only begin to answer that. There's a lot more work that would have to be done to really fully answer that question, but there's at least three things that we point to. So one important part is the role of the media. So in the book, we show how part of this strategy is to target the media, to supply the media with white papers, press briefings, press releases, presenting this other side of the so-called debate in order to persuade the media to give equal time to their views. And so many journalists who are not familiar with the science or haven't got the time to really do a lot of background investigation, they receive these materials and they would say, oh, there's a big debate, and they would get sort of sucked into this debate framework. And this was a very big part of their strategy. And I think we've seen that it was very effective because many articles and reports in the United States have presented all of these issues as big raging debates long after the science was actually settled.
But Naomi, isn't that also because journalists are told when they go to journalism school or however they get their qualification that they must provide balance in a story?
Well, exactly. So what these folks are doing is they're exploiting the journalistic ideal of balance and using it again against journalists and against the science, because of course balance is important if it's a question of a truly debated issue or a political issue where there's a wide range of opinions. But of course, presenting a scientific issue in a, quote, balanced way, when in reality all of the evidence is on one side, is actually an inaccurate way of presenting the story. So you end up with inaccurate reporting, but in the name of balance and objectivity. So again, it's a very tricky strategy, and it's proved very effective. The second important part of the story, of course, is that these people are very well funded. And in the book, we talk about how, during the 1990s, we see this emergence of a whole network of think tanks that is not just the George Marshall Institute, which is, in the book, we trace the story to origins in the Marshall Institute, but the book is not, it's not fundamentally about the Marshall Institute. It's fundamentally about this phenomenon of doubt mongering, which spreads to organizations like the Cato Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Heartland Institute. There's a whole laundry list of these organizations that become involved in doubt mongering. Now, many of them, it's not always easy to determine who exactly is funding these organizations, but we were able to show that in the 1990s, many of these groups got money from either the tobacco industry or the coal industry. And other scholars like Ross Gelbspan and Chris Mooney have done further work tracing ExxonMobil sources, other fossil fuel industries that have given significant amounts of money. The Coke industries, Jane Mayer recently wrote about their funding in the New Yorker. So we see fossil fuel industries joining in the 1990s to support this network of doubt mongering.
Well, my question there, though, is why you can understand why some of these industries, like the fossil fuel industry, would want to continue their business and continue in the way that they have been over the past 100 years or so. But what about the scientists that are under their employ to create this doubt and to feed the media this stuff? Why? I mean, my question is, what's going through those scientists' minds that they would want to lead the public in the wrong direction?
Right. Well, of course, they don't think they're leading the public in the wrong direction. This is a key part of the story that we tell in the book. So in a way, what you see is a kind of unholy alliance of people, industries motivated by the bottom line, but individuals motivated by political ideology. So the story begins with the tobacco industry, but then it grows with the founding of the Marshall Institute. And the Marshall Institute was not originally founded to deal with global warming or acid rain or anything like that. It was founded to defend Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, what most of us know of as Star Wars. And this is really a crucial part of the story, because if we ask ourselves the question, why did Bill Nierenberg, Fred Seitz, and Robert Jastrow create the Marshall Institute? It was because they believed that strategic defense was necessary to defend the United States from the Soviet Union. And they were very powerful advocates of the importance of a technologically based, robust defense of the United States against what they perceived to be a persistent and very powerful Soviet threat. Now, we know in hindsight that their estimation of the Soviet strength was greatly exaggerated. They created the Marshall Institute in 1984. Only 5 years later, the Berlin Wall comes down and the Soviet Union begins to disintegrate. But nevertheless, it's an extension of the work they've done all their lives as Cold War scientists, building weapons programs, building technological systems to defend the West from the communist East. What happened? Of course, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, with the fall of communism, or with the sense that the communist countries were no longer a real threat, there was then, of course, an attempt to, well, a very successful attempt to demonize environmentalists. And I was fascinated to read about the attacks on Rachel Carson, because some of those techniques were, well, you can see them happening in terms of Ben Santa and Michael Mann. You can see them going on today with the ClimateGate emails being used to demonize Phil Jones. Those, the playbook, as it were, is now being used, it seems, without any sense of morality or perspective.
Exactly. And I think that makes sense when we think about the ideology that's driving it. So for the people who began this story, they have a conviction that they're defending the free world, that they're defending freedom, they're defending liberty, all good things, all things we would all agree with. But then it takes on this sort of paranoid quality. They begin to allege that environmentalists are really communists in disguise. They refer to them as watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. So it becomes a kind of generalized anxiety of which environmentalists become the focus. And then that spreads. It's like a disease, a kind of virus that then spreads to attacking not just environmentalists, but scientists who are working on environmental issues. And as you say, these recent attacks that we've seen are more of the same, except even worse. It just gets worse and worse, and as time goes on, it becomes more unprincipled, more virulent, more personal, and really more inexplicable and more inexcusable.
What then, Naomi, do you see as the tipping point where the opposite argument, the skeptics' argument, becomes no longer tenable, just like the tobacco cancer link?
Well, that's a really good question. Of course, that's the big unanswered question at the end of the book. And, some of our readers have pointed out there's an optimistic reading of the book and there's a pessimistic reading. The optimistic reading is if you look at all these other issues like acid rain and the ozone hole, ultimately the truth came out. Ultimately, the world recognized that the scientific evidence did point to a real and serious threat, and the world found solutions, and we did take action to control acid rain and to protect the ozone layer. So the optimistic reading is that the same thing will happen with global warming, and we will move forward and we will have a solution. The pessimistic reading is that this problem is much worse than the others. More is at stake. Our entire economic system rests on the use of fossil fuels, and we've known about this problem since the 1950s. There's been a scientific consensus on the reality of global warming since the second assessment report of the IPCC in 1995. So we've wasted a lot of time, and the problem has gotten steadily worse. And now we're seeing potential damage to the environment that is irreversible.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that they can run this campaign while the effects of global warming, to me, are undeniable. I think the evidence is undeniable, but they're not yet as bad as they will be in 30 years' time. And every year of delay now is not a year worse now, it's a year worse in 30 years when the impacts may be, unimaginably bad. So, I mean, when ClimateGate happened, I thought that it was desperation in a way, that they were being forced to be so virulent because they thought they were losing in the run-up to Copenhagen. Would that be your interpretation?
Yeah, I felt the same way too. And actually, I thought that the whole stolen email affair, I thought it did reflect a certain kind of desperation, because one thing that was different about that than everything we wrote about in the book is that they had crossed the line into illegality. As far as we know, everything that happened that we documented in the book, it may have been unethical, it may have been unprincipled, but as far as we know, none of it was actually illegal. That changed with the stealing of emails and the hacking into computers. So I did think it showed a kind of desperation. And in a weird way, I thought, well, this will backfire. This will work against them because they're doing things that are illegal. So it was very, very strange to me when the press, launched this sort of weird bandwagon thing of assuming that scientists had done something wrong, and this weird kind of schadenfreude of catching scientists out being human beings, being frustrated, grappling with evidence, doing all the normal things that human beings do. And then we saw public opinion actually being influenced by it. That was very shocking to me and very depressing. Mm.
And finally, Naomi, because you call them merchants of doubt, and I've also heard these people also called the forces of darkness. Is it really that dramatic?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you can decide for yourself. In the book we try to let readers draw their own conclusions, but they're merchants of doubt because doubt is the key strategy, right? And it emerges from that classic, often cited tobacco document from 1969 where a tobacco industry executive wrote, "Doubt is our product." So that was their words. It was the tobacco industry who invented this strategy and who recognized that you could sell doubt, you could manufacture, merchandise, exaggerate, amplify doubt, and that was a very effective strategy for challenging science and therefore delaying regulation. So that's where the title comes from. But I think the book does clearly show that these people did a lot of damage. Many people died from tobacco-related illnesses long after that should not have been the case. A tremendous amount of damage was done to the northeastern forests of the United States and Canada, as well as the forests of Germany and Scandinavia because of acid rain. The ozone hole is going to recover, but it's still going to take a long time. So we think real, true, genuine damage was done in all of these stories. And of course, with global warming, we're beginning to see the damage all around us.
Gareth, any final comments from you?
Yeah, I'd just like to ask Naomi, where next? I mean, have you got any feelings about whether they'll just continue to run with this campaign, or is there any sense that they might be kind of repositioning for a let's not, you can see it in the Breakthrough Institute's position of let's do the technology, spend lots of money on R&D, but let's not stop burning fossil fuels, that sort of thing. Do you have any sense of where they may be going with this?
Well, no, I don't really, although as you said, I think there is a quality of desperation about some of what these folks are doing now. And here in Australia, we've been talking a lot about certain Australian skeptics and deniers who honestly are nowhere near the scientists that at least Bill Nierenberg and Fred Seitz were. I mean, one thing about our story, Fred Seitz, Bill Nierenberg, and Bob Jastrow were very distinguished scientists. So I think it's understandable, at least in the beginning, that journalists listened to them and thought that what they had to say would be credible because they were very famous, very successful, and quite frankly, very, very brilliant scientists. The people who are challenging climate science today are nowhere near Bill Nierenberg was. So that to me does speak a kind of desperation. But on the other hand, caged animals sometimes do very damaging things. So just because they're desperate doesn't mean that they won't continue to do damage.
Well, Naomi, it's been so fantastic to talk to you, and I know you've got such a busy schedule there, and for taking some time out to talk to us here in New Zealand on the Climate Show. It's really a treat, really.
Thank you. It's really nice talking to you too.
Thank you very much, Naomi. And I'd just like to repeat that if any of our listeners haven't read Merchants of Doubt, it really is a must-read book because it lays bare the sort of underlying organization of denial that has brought at least 10 years worth of delay of action on climate change, and that's 10 years worth more damage at the end of the road. And I would personally like to see the people who organized it held up to account. Anyway, Naomi, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your tour of Australia.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, and do get the book, and whatever way you want to consume it. I know I consumed mine on the Kindle. It was the very first book that I ever got on the Kindle as well, which so no trees died in the making of that book. It's called Merchants of Doubt: How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. Right, now's a good time to bring back John Cook at skepticalscience.com for the Debunking the Skeptic segment here on the Climate Show. Hello to you, John.
G'day.
G'day, John. How's Brisbane?
Yeah, it's getting warm this time of the year. It's pretty humid at the moment.
And I've also got to show our appreciation for hooking up the interview that we've just had with Naomi with the Merchants of Doubt book, because she's just been on a tour through Brisbane, and you met up with her as well.
Yeah, it was the first time I'd met her. Yeah, it was great. She's a really interesting person and a very warm, funny person. So yeah, it was great to meet her.
Yeah, great. Well, I was perusing Mashable.com, quite a popular sort of social media website this week, and I saw this story entitled "Twitter Bot Auto Debates Climate Change Critics." And that was actually an extension of another story I was reading about a New Zealand guy who created a Twitter bot that buys items automatically off Trade Me for him, which is quite far out. And he in fact has got some worldwide attention for doing that. And so this is a similar sort of story. And then I forwarded the story to you, and it turns out that you actually have a link to this story.
Yeah, when the news broke, a lot of people emailed me saying, have you heard what this guy's doing? You should be involved in that. And yeah, I've actually been working with him for several months. So yeah, I was aware of it.
What actually does this Twitter bot do?
Well, the guy who developed it, Nigel Leck, he's a programmer from Sydney, and he actually has his own Twitter account, Climate Debate, where he just goes on Twitter and I guess argues about climate issues with people who post, I guess, skeptic tweets. And when I first started talking with him, he said his main motivation was a lot of the climate blogs tend to preach to the choir. You know, they have their own little groups who all agree with them. And what he wanted to do was get out there and you know, find people who disagreed with him and hash out the issue. And so he thought Twitter was a good place to do it.
Yeah.
But doing it manually, I guess is a pretty time-consuming thing, as anyone who's got into online debates can attest. So he created a bot, like an automatic script that looks for just certain key phrases, because if you're involved in the climate debate for any amount of time, what you realize is you just see the same arguments rehashed over and over and over again. And in fact, after hearing Naomi talk last night, you actually hear that those same arguments have been rehashed for 40 years by the same people, and not just applied to global warming, but to a whole bunch of scientific issues. So what Nigel did was he wrote a bot that looks for, just certain key phrases that would, clearly indicate it's expressing, a certain skeptic argument. And then his bot would post an automatic response, just pointing to a URL where proper information could be found.
So if I tweeted out now, climate change rubbish, it's just the sun, do you think it would hit me back?
It'd be interesting. Why don't we do a test and see what happens?
I might do that now, actually, while you're talking about it. But one of the things, of course, about Twitter is it's only 140, 160 characters. I always forget, but you can't. I mean, it's really hard to have a debate in such a short form.
That's right. I mean, 140 characters, and that's one of my major themes on my website, is that on Skeptical Science, is that to properly understand science, you have to take in the full body of evidence and to get the full picture. And so with a tweet, it's not the final answer, it's just pointing people to to a place where they can get all the information. So I see it as like a first step, not the final step.
Yeah, I was interested because I spotted this Twitter bot AIAGW coming into Hot Topic, and it always seemed to be ending up on one particular post about Lord Christopher Monckton. So obviously one of something I posted about Monckton's fraudulent use of climate data has been picked up by Nigel, which is fantastic.
So he was actually responding to your tweets, was he?
No, not at all. No, one of the chatbots replies leads to a Monckton post of mine.
Right. I see. Yeah. And one of the things that Nigel was very careful about was that often people would tweet something, maybe saying something sarcastic like, "Yeah, right, climate change is a hoax" or something. Not meaning it. Like if a human reads it, they could obviously tell that it was sarcastic, but the bot would have trouble, picking up on the sarcastic tone.
Yeah. The tweet that I'm just about to send out could be perceived as sarcastic, I suppose. I'm going to tweet out, "Human-induced climate change, it's rubbish. It's just the sun. # the climate show." What do you reckon? Do you think?
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Okay. I'm tweeting it out. It's gone out there now. I'm bound to be hassled by not just bots, but people as well.
You could start a whole narrative. Glenn Williams recants.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I did read this morning that somebody had actually written. I'm not sure it was actually a book, but it was a sort of a work of textual art as a sequence of tweets, which I thought was quite interesting. And I've often thought that tweets are actually a bit like haiku. You know, they have to be short and pithy. So how did you go about getting the skeptical science arguments down to those 140 characters, John?
Yeah, it's a bit like sweating blood, really, trying to do that. It's actually
it's like a Brisbane summer then.
It's a bit like that. So I'm used to that kind of pain. It's actually been probably a couple of years journey, because when I started Skeptical Science, I guess one of the main goals was just to make peer-reviewed science accessible to the average person. And so I would write these articles explaining what the peer-reviewed papers would say about a specific issue, and tried to make it as understandable as possible. And then a few years ago, somebody emailed me saying, could I just add a little paragraph at the top, maybe in a little box or something, just summarizing it in just a few lines, so that people didn't have to read the whole article. And my response was, no, they can read the whole article if they want to understand it. But as I thought about it, I realized it was, not everyone is going to take the time to understand every little nook and cranny of a scientific issue. So I wrote these paragraph answer for every single rebuttal on my site. And then earlier this year, there was a guy from the States, Jan Dash, and he was running some climate workshops in New Jersey. And he asked if he could use the content from my site at his workshop, where people were just engaging in, I guess, climate debates, where one person would be a skeptic and the other person would argue, that humans are causing global warming, and using the stuff from my site as reference material. And after the workshop, he came back and he said, unanimous feedback from everyone at the workshop was that my website content was too complex. It was too hard to understand. And that was a bit of a kick in the guts when he told me that. But what he offered, I kind of, I have been trying to explain things as simply as I could. But for some people, I guess if you're maybe it's like getting into a hot bath. If you've been in it for a long time, you don't notice just how hot it is. So anyway, what Jan offered to do was just write one-line rebuttals. Like even summarize my paragraph answers even shorter. And I said, yeah, well, good luck with that if you can do it. I didn't really think he could, but then he disappeared for a couple of weeks, and I thought that would be the end of it. And a couple of weeks later, he emailed me back, and he'd just written all of them. He'd just gone through all 100 or so rebuttals, and he'd written a one-line answer. And as I read through them, I thought, oh, these are actually pretty good. Like, I wish I'd thought of explaining it like that. And so I put those all up on the website. Now, at about the same time, Nigel emailed me and just mentioned this Twitter bot he was working on. And I hadn't even officially put my one-line answers on the website yet. But it was just it was an eerie coincidence. So I said, oh, do you want to have a look at these? And he had a look at them all, and he said, yeah, that's exactly what I need. But could you just make them 100 characters? Like make sure they go a little bit shorter. So I had to go through all of them and just, prune away until I could get them to 100 characters. And sometimes it was, it was hard to prune it without losing any meaning in the statement. But we managed to get it down. So every one-line answer was 100 characters, and then he took those and turned them all into tweets and put them into his database.
Oh, it's certainly an interesting exercise. I followed up one link which went to a site called Hacker News, and the top comment was that in a way what Lekker's created is a proactive search engine. It answers Twitter users who aren't even aware of their own ignorance. And he says it's a bit like Microsoft Office's Clippy, the little paperclip that pops up and offers you sometimes helpful advice. Yeah. And he says, so if you can imagine Clippy for the internet, and he's popping up and he says, I see you're trying to deny global warming. Would you like to? 1, research the available facts and science. 2, have an authority figure you trust tell you you're wrong. And 3, meet other like-minded singles. The other thought that struck me was that, John, when you did the iPhone app, which I plugged in our first issue because it really is a tremendous resource,
and Android app as well, which I've downloaded. Yeah, it's really good.
We have to be ecumenical these days. Of course, that prompted the skeptics to go out and do their own app, which was something I blogged about a while ago. So I'm just wondering now if there isn't going to be a climate skeptic Twitter bot out there, and you could end up with the two bots having a kind of cyber war over in the Twitterverse, consuming bandwidth as they bandy arguments back and forth all day long.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's how the Terminator movie started. So.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, I think I'm being suitably ignored on Twitter. No response from human or bot so far to that. What I thought was a provocative tweet.
I think the way that the bot works is every like 10 or 5 or 10 minutes or at some interval, it just checks. It does a quick search.
Yeah.
So, but it's also possible that your Twitter account might be on his list of Twitter accounts not to respond to. Like if there's a Twitter account that he knows wouldn't post skeptic blog posts, and he doesn't want to respond to your sarcastic tweets. So.
Also, it may not be responding to such obvious goading. Maybe it only goes for the subtle.
It's beneath its dignity to respond.
Yeah, exactly.
I expect it's Murphy's law, and the minute we stop recording will be the minute we get the response from the bot. So.
Yeah.
I should also point out that the iPhone app and the Android app and this Twitter bot, they're all done in Australia too, and even the Skeptic iPhone app is Australian. So we've got
really?
Yeah, we've got a lot of climate geeks here in Australia.
Indeed. Well, John, thanks so much for talking about the Twitter bot. There is the story up on Mashable, and of course you can also head to skepticalscience.com. Look forward to having you back next time debunking.
Yeah, have you got any ideas about what we should be talking about next time, John? What's the hot topic at the moment, if you'll forgive the phrase?
Well, ironically, I was thinking global cooling might be a good subject to tackle.
Oh, excellent, because one of the slots we had in the news section at the head of the show was talking about a new paper which says that Arctic ice loss could lead to colder winters in the Northern Hemisphere. So, yeah, that'd be a good one to talk about.
Great.
Thanks, John. Look forward to catching up with you soon.
See you guys.
Cheers, John.
Cheers.
See you. Again, before we move along, Gareth, to the final part of the show, the solutions part, where we're going to be talking electric cars and a few other things. Let's also thank your website, your home on the internet, hot-topic.co.nz, because without you doing that and the book and the community around that, I don't think the show would be happening at all.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. As I said before, Hot Topic's really pleased to be doing this, and what's been really encouraging is just the amount of material there is that's out there for making a program like this. I mean, when I'm blogging on Hot Topic, there's a huge amount of stuff I can't cover, but there's also a lot of stuff that you'd just like to have a chat about and that you want to draw people's attention to. And I think the show like this is a really good way just to explore some of the issues that maybe would demand in a blog format, a long essay or something, and we can have a quick chat about something and draw people's attention to things. And there's just such a lot of that, and there's so many interesting people. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and the book's still available?
Yeah, I think so. It's a wee bit long in the tooth now, but it's still there. I guess you can order it from the site. We do a PDF version, so save a tree, and
Because it is one of those sort of dynamic subjects that keeps on evolving. You still stand by everything that's in the book?
Yeah, the bit that's dated most really is not the science, because basically I was writing it as the AR4 was. The IPCC's fourth report was being published, so it's up to date with the last major report. What's changed out of all recognition is the situation in New Zealand, because I was writing the book before the last Labour government announced an emissions trading scheme, so I was kind of having to guess what was going to happen in New Zealand. Much of what I wrote about New Zealand at the time remains true, but obviously the politics of it and the emissions trading scheme and everything else has moved on a very, very long way from there. Yeah, one day I'll update it, but possibly not soon.
Yeah. Well, on to the final part of the show. First story in the solutions segment is electric cars. Over 1 million electric cars are expected to be on Asian roads by 2015. Actually, that doesn't sound like a lot.
Well, it doesn't when you think that there are probably hundreds of millions of cars on the road in Asia, and when you think that the growth of vehicle use in China is huge, but it's way more than I put it in there because it's a headline number that's a lot larger than people have been thinking out for our local markets, for European and American markets. And what it does show is that a lot of the growth that's going to come in the world is going to come in those Asian markets. More than half of all plug-in electric vehicles are expected to be sold in China, where they've got government incentives, and they're expecting an annual growth of 76% by 2015. So it's just a new research report taking a look at what's likely to come up in the Asian markets over the next few years. And I just thought I thought it would be an interesting thing to follow up on what we were saying about electric vehicles last time. That here was here's a market where they're going to be big and very important. Yeah,
well, and these stats that you're talking about, I mean, there's this purely electric, not hybrid vehicles.
Yeah, they're talking about it being. They actually talk about plug-in hybrids and all electric vehicles, but they think it's the plug-in electric vehicles will be sold in China, whereas it'll be hybrids that are going best in Japan. So yeah, there'll be different markets will have different mixes of whether they're a sort of range extended thing with a petrol engine and electric motor, or whether they're a pure electric vehicle. And the reason they're differentiating that in the report, because that has different impacts on the market for batteries, or the market for people making the charging stations that will have to be in car parks and so on. So it's just a sign, I think, that the sort of infrastructure for electric vehicles, the expectations for electric vehicles, is becoming very, very well established, and there's a kind of a bit of inertia developing in the market that we'll see them grow in the immediate future.
Brilliant. Okay, our final solution, our final story for how we're going to dig ourselves out of this climate mess involves steady state economics, which is a huge subject. Gareth, what is this all about?
Yeah, well, I put it in there because, as I said, a couple of minutes ago, there are some issues that demand, if you're going to cover them in a blog or in an article, you're going to have to write a hell of a lot. But this is something I found an excellent site that I wanted to draw people's attentions to. It's the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. What is a steady state economy? It's an economy which doesn't rely on growth. So it's about living within your planetary means, because we've got, it's the old story, we've got 6.8 billion people on the planet at the moment. If they all want to live like Americans live, then we're going to run out of everything, not just the biosphere and ecosystems, but we'll run out of steel and coal and oil and everything else. It just physically isn't possible for us to all live the way that the richest people in the world live. So we need to find a way of having a vibrant economy which enables people to work and live and have a quality of life that doesn't depend on continuously growing. And the website says that perpetual economic growth is neither possible nor desirable. Growth, especially in wealthy nations, is already causing more problem
more problems than it solves. And they go on to say that recession isn't sustainable or healthy either. So the positive, sustainable alternative is a steady state economy. And it's one of the founders of this view is an economist called Herman Daly, and he's heavily involved with this CASSE website. And it's a really good resource. There's a lot of interesting material on there discussing how we can go about moving towards steady state economy. So instead of being paranoid because the New Zealand economy isn't growing or isn't growing as fast as Australia's, we should be looking at the aspects of the economy that enable us all to earn a living, to have a quality of life and a living standard that we enjoy and gives us some real quality in the way that we live. And it doesn't mean that we always have to be, earning more, growing more, burning more.
But Gareth, I have to keep up with the Joneses. They just bought a brand new car last week. It's a big car, it's a big SUV. I've got to get one as well. I saw that they had a bigger TV as well. I've got to get a big one. I have to keep up with them, otherwise my self-worth just goes down the toilet.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, but small is beautiful. And there are lots of ways in which we can have a quality of life without consuming huge amounts of stuff. I mean, it's an old saying in the wine business, but life's too short to drink bad wine. And I'd rather have a bottle of the good stuff and enjoy it over a couple of days than drink 2 bottles of grot and end up with a hangover the following morning. And we just have to apply that to all of the things that we do. Maybe it's better to have a smart, small, efficient car and maybe only hire the 4-wheel drive when you want to go skiing. Do things that enable you to do what you want to do, but don't involve prodigious use of resources.
Yeah.
And the sad sort of truth underlying all this is that if we're not smart about it, if we don't do this ourselves, then actually the planet is going to force us to do it. And you mentioned a book when we were chatting before the program, Climate Wars by Gwyn Dyer. And one of the things in Climate Wars is Gwyn is exploring the things that can go wrong when we run out of goods and services, and the climate starts to bite back. Yeah, well, that's what happens when you run into those limits to growth, to quote the name of a famous book from the 1970s. But people like to pretend the limits aren't there, but they really are, and we've got to be very smart to avoid it. So without going into a huge amount of detail, this is just a good and interesting website, and I'd recommend everybody have a look around, and maybe we can argue about it in the comments at Hot Topic.
Yeah, we certainly, I think, yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it is a huge topic, and the more you think about it, just one example here in this part of the world is this need for New Zealand to catch up or be better than Australia, and it's all centred around economic growth and wages, and we must be keeping up effectively with the Joneses that are the Australians next door, and it's enormously frustrating to constantly hear that that's the only way we will feel valuable about ourselves.
Yeah, that's right. And unfortunately, all of the metrics that we use to judge ourselves against Australia, with no disrespect to John, we don't count the mountains, and we don't count the clean streams, and we don't count the Abel Tasman Park, and all of the things that the people who live here really, really value don't get counted in the cost of living.
Absolutely. Well, that has basically been a show, I think, Gareth.
Yeah, it's really good. I'm very, very pleased that we managed to get Naomi to find some time in her schedule. Really interesting chat with her. Yeah, some good material. Thanks to John for coming in and chatting about his chatbot.
And I've got to say thanks very much to the Kiwi crew who have allowed me to do the recording of this. in the Kiwi studio here, which is normally broadcasting throughout the day, but we've got a little window that we can get in here in between live programs, which is fantastic. And don't forget that there are a bunch of other video programs that do come out of the studio as well, including my show, the Radio Whammo Breakfast, which you can find up on the Radio Whammo channel, or whammo.co.nz, or kiwifm.co.nz. And so thanks very much to Kiwi FM for lending the time here. Now, just a couple of housekeeping duties to take care of. There are ways to subscribe to the show, particularly to the audio. Hope to get the video at some stage through iTunes, but currently just the audio in iTunes. Love you to subscribe there. The links will be up at hot-topic.co.nz. Also, if you just want to download the audio by itself, or play it, I think there's a little player, or watch it on YouTube. So there's many ways to enjoy. I think, is that covering everything yet?
Yeah, I think so. The YouTube one's particularly good because Glenn is popping up graphs and images and so on while we're talking, so it gives you some idea of what's actually going on. It's a miracle that Glenn can do it, I think. Modern technology, isn't it wonderful, eh?
It's held together with bits of tape at the moment, but hopefully
we've got the sellotape on Skype at the moment. Yeah,
hopefully that'll get better through time. And you might have also noticed that that suddenly I was in another studio doing when we were talking to Naomi as well. That's because we've kind of bounced around in our timeline as well. But it's all happened within this 1 week. So thanks so much for downloading and listening, watching, and thanks to you, Gareth. Cheers. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn, and see you all out there in podcast land quite soon.
Yeah, see ya.